Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the latest of a lecture series devoted to the subject of the history of capitalism. And this evening, Philipp Blom has flown in from Vienna, especially to be with us to talk about after the war, after the crash and before the war. But in fact, he says he wants to talk about the 1920s as well as the 1930s, so it'll be after some bangs and before some even more bangs. My name is Howell Williams, and I look after the History of Capitalism course here as part of the Culture of Prosperity program at the Legatum Institute. And it is with great pleasure that I acknowledge, as I always do, the generous support of the Legatum Foundation in putting forward this program. The History of Capitalism curriculum, right, the work of this institute as a whole, is very much concerned with the interaction, the connection between different disciplines, different ways of thinking, in history, politics, and economics. And in thinking about the last of this year's lectures, it seemed to us, therefore, very appropriate to turn to Philipp, whose books really give us a very full account of the connections between these different disciplines in the course of the interwar era. He is very much a kind of legatum person, if I can advertise him in that way before the deed, because he's not only a very accomplished social and intellectual historian, he has also translated a hitherto very obscure libretto by Charles Gounod. He has written a novel, and he has written extensively on the once vexed but now very acclaimed subject of the wines of Austria. So it is very great pleasure to have him with us here this evening. This afternoon, in the late afternoon, we had a very brilliant seminar on the subject of the history of economic policy in the 1930s, a very revisionist account of just why and how it was that Britain's economy was able to escape some of the worst effects of the worldwide recession. And it is to a further exercise in historiographical revision, perhaps, that we now prepare ourselves to listen with great delight to Philipp Blom. Thank you.
Thank you and good evening. I'm not sure how much revisionist history I can give you, but definitely after some bangs and before some more bangs is the most elegant lecture title that I've ever devised. I am, as you've just heard, not an academic historian, yes, but also an economic historian. I am something that when I was studying in this country, it really didn't exist, a sort of intellectual or cultural historian. It is sort of slyly making its way into the curriculum, but it is still lagging. What I want to talk to you about is the interwar era, not from an economic point of view, but from a cultural point of view. In particular, asking how did this vast and enormous event of the First World War, what repercussions, what echoes did it have in the cultures of the time, in the cultures and societies of the time? I have also been informed, to my absolute terror, that I've only got 30 minutes to talk to you, so I have to either talk very quickly or leave a lot out. On the other hand, there will be questions, so I may be able to catch up. Let me just take you back for 5 minutes to set the stage to the time before the First World War. A time that we today often read about, see in movies and hear about as a golden age, an age of tranquility and security. A sort of merchant ivory version of history. Well, the people who lived through that time, the years between, say, 1900 and 1914, would have been tremendously surprised to hear that that was the good old days. When you read their diaries, when you read their letters, they describe a world that is exploding. They describe a world in which technology is changing by the day, in which cities are doubling in size, in which for the first time in human history more people lived in cities than lived in the countryside. And if you hear the growth indices today of countries, and they're sort of around 2 or 3%, and everybody's very happy, well, back then 10% was in Western Europe not all that extraordinary. Those were different times. those were a time of explosion of mass culture and modernity. They were the time when industrial modernity really bit deeply into societies and affected not thousands or hundreds of thousands, but tens of millions of people. That had many fascinating consequences I have not a minute to talk about, but it did something very strange. It changed that's much better, thank you. It changed one relationship above all others, and that is the relationship between men and women. Why did it do that? Because in a modern society there is no longer any structural need really to treat women differently than men, and women at that time noticed that. The 1900s and 1910s are the time of the most exciting feminist writers whose argument are only coming back in the 1970s. And it is also a time in which many men are feeling the pressure. They're feeling the pressure of living in a modern society in which everything is up for grabs, in which everything is up for negotiation, in which there's no traditional set authority as such anymore. And what you get to see is not only a feminist revolution, but also a huge intensification and increase in what historians call rituals of masculinity. You have more duels being fought in civil society than ever before. People are sporting better waxed moustaches. People are running around in uniforms. This is the time of the first bodybuilding craze. Why am I telling you this? Not just for little anecdotes, but because when the war in 1914 came, and why it came would be a lecture in itself, I think it was effectively probably a huge accident. But when it came, for millions of men, of young men particularly, it was an opportunity, and they wrote that in their diaries, in their poems, in their letters home. It was an opportunity to reassert and find back their masculinity. They could be real men again, with the saber in the hand, facing the opponent, looking him in the eye, and fighting man to man. That, at least, was the fantasy. The reality looked very different, and this is why I have made such a long excursion to build this up, because this reality is really important. In the Franco-Prussian War, 1870 to 71, 9 out of 10 soldiers died from wounds received in direct combat, hand-to-hand combat, with a saber, with a bayonet, with a pistol. In the First World War, 3% of soldiers on the Western Front died in hand-to-hand combat. Many died from illnesses, but an enormous number was simply blown to pieces while sitting in the trench and waiting for something else to happen. And now imagine what that meant psychologically and culturally, that these men had gone there in their millions to fight for something, for king and country, for the fatherland, whatever, for la République. And they found that they were integrated in a machine of entirely random killing. And when I say it's a machine, the Western Front, and the Western Front was by no means the only front of the First World War, it wasn't even the deadliest one, but it is the one that left its deepest marks on European cultural history. And I have completely lost my train of thought over the defending the Western Front.
Random machinery.
Yes, no, thank you. It is coming back to me very slowly. And at the Western Front, particularly from 1916, something changed, because you all know the stories of the idiot generals sending cavalry charges against machine guns. Well, that was so for a very brief time, because the generals weren't as idiotic as all that. They saw that the war had changed, and the war was very, very quickly mechanized. And by 1916, especially from the Battle of the Somme in July 1916, this was a fully mechanized war. a war like it had never been won before. And now soldiers were not fighting other soldiers. Soldiers were fighting machines, machines that were far bigger than them. Machines, if there were artillery cannon that could fire projectiles over 30 miles and kill them, against poison gas, against tanks. It was no longer an equal fight. And you find in the interwar time something that I want to talk to you about for the remaining time. You find a re-evaluation of the story of man and machine. And it begins with, and you may look that up if you want on YouTube, there are some very moving original footage of shell shock victims in England. And that was something new to warfare. Everybody knew of soldiers who couldn't forget the faces of those they'd killed. But here were soldiers who were so shattered by the constant noise, the constant danger, the constant misery of their lives at the front, that they literally broke down and started shaking convulsively and could no longer stop and had to be, first of all, they were shot at dawn as cowards. But when there were tens of thousands of cases, the medical profession finally consented to seeing this as a real problem and to treat these people. But you may say that the entirety of Europe was in shell shock after this First World War. It was in shell shock not only because so many young people had died, not only because this war had been particularly cruel, but because in the end nobody could really explain what people had been fighting for. And in the end, all the great ideals that people had been fighting for appeared to be so much political rhetoric. And that left a very empty feeling. But it also left a lot of veterans on the streets, veterans who had lost limbs, veterans who had lost half of their faces, and who were quite literally part man and part machine because they were wearing prosthetic limbs. And that begins to be a theme that comes back in art, for instance, again and again. It comes back with artists like Georges Gros and Otto Dix. It also comes back with Epstein in England with his rock drill sculpture. You see that artists are all of a sudden wandering. And this is a story in a way that was only beginning then. It wasn't quite beginning then, but that was intensifying then, but of course has intensified hugely more since then and up to today. Where does the machine end and the person start? How much are we changed by the use of smartphones? How much will we be changed by the use of by the use of retinal implants? How much are we changed by artificial organs? And when will computers finally become more intelligent than we are? Well, these are questions that we are asking ourselves today. Back then, this was the beginning of this question being asked. You may have heard of the film Metropolis. A remarkably bad film, although it is still celebrated as a masterpiece, but it is a fairly bad film because its maker wasn't at all, Fritz Lang, wasn't at all interested in the plot line. He was interested in the special effects, and he built some of the greatest and most exciting special effects of the day. But the story is one that reads as if it's desperately overdue for a Hollywood remake, because it's the happy 1% living on top of the benighted and exploited 99% who have to work in huge factories underground in order to finance the life of the 1% and their luxury. Now, Metropolis lays on its metaphors rather heavily, so the workers have to work at a hard machine, and all of a sudden you get this crossover again between the organic and the mechanical. And the hard machine, of course, devours workers, but when the workers want to finally rebel, they get a sort of messiah's figure set in front of them, a woman. And when they finally want to rebel, the messiah's figure is exchanged for what? Yes, a robot. And the robot is there to lead them into their perdition, to lead them into their death. So technology is a bad thing. This is also the time of the remake of a story written at the beginning of the 19th century by the wife of Percy Bysshe Shelley, Mary Shelley, who wrote a little novella called Frankenstein, Frankenstein's Monster. And At this time, the rights were bought for this story, and they found an English actor who had the unpromising name for a grand career of Henry Pratt, but he called himself Boris Karloff and made a better career with that. But again, nobody who had seen veterans from the First World War could overlook the hint of the doctor patching together a human body out of body parts on an operating table and resuscitating it to ghastly mechanical life. But actually the key sentence comes from Metropolis, which is ironic because it's a silent film, but it has titles in the middle. And it is the Dr. Faust-like inventor who has built the robot. And the Dr. Faust-like inventor has a prosthetic hand. Now, the film is made in 1926, and there's a very clear connection there to all the veterans with their prosthetic limbs. And he is asked about how he got this prosthetic hand, and he lifts up the hand, and it's an expressionist film, and of course you've got a huge shadow behind him on the wall of this lifted hand, and he says, "What is it to lose a hand against the chance to create a new man?" And that becomes, surprisingly, Western culture's answer to the trauma of the war. I could exercise this also in the United States, but in the interest of concision, I have to leave that out at the moment. But the idea that the reign of the machine, the power of the machine cannot be broken by us because we are effectively already redundant, but only by a new kind of human being, engineered to perfection, something better than modern humanity, takes hold then. And it is basically exercised in two different, shall we say, flavors. There is fascist new man, and fascist new man, as Mussolini wanted him, as Hitler wanted him, is basically a very old man, because the idea is we are in such a muddle because we are such a muddle. We are so diluted and polluted by different influences that only if we can find back to the essential quality of one great race can we regain dominance over history again. And therefore, Hitler's racial programs. It was bringing humanity back, or at least Germanic humanity back, to a state in which, of course, it had never been, but which was imagined to have been real. But the new man was a lot of badly read Nietzsche in that. The new man was stronger, prouder, more intelligent, more fierce, more remorseless than anything that had been there. And he would sweep all cultures, and indeed all culture, away in front of him and create a new world. The interesting thing is that the intellectual, ideological antagonists of the Nazis and the fascists, the socialists, well, let me put it this way. If you had taken down a statue at night in Berlin of a grand, muscly new man and flown it to Moscow to a square and erected it there secretly, and people had woken up in the morning, they wouldn't have known the difference. Because socialist new man looked exactly like fascist new man. He was just as muscly and strutting and strong. But there was a difference, because whereas fascist new man came from some romantic imagination of nature and essentialism, socialist and communist new man was a machine. He was very explicitly meant to be a machine. There was even in the Soviet Union a visionary labor theoretician named Ivan Gastev, who had an institute in which workers were literally strapped to contrivances that taught them to make the right mechanical movement again and again in the most efficient possible way. People should be as similar to machines as possible. They were put into houses that were, in Le Corbusier's words, machines for living. They had, at least in the ideas of the visionaries, plans for their daily lives that were planned to the last minute, down to the fact when they could digest and when they could have an hour of free time. Society was a machine, and the ideal individual was a machine or like a machine. I feel that these are only the merest indication of a very great theme, but let me pick it up before I invite you to ask your questions and perhaps probe one or two aspects of this great story. Let me just perhaps address one point straight away, because it may look as if there's a lot of parallels between then and now. Man and machine is definitely, now we no longer say man, now we say humanity, and for good reasons. But our relationship to the mechanical, the electronical, is one of the greatest themes that is facing us in the next decades. And we have no idea how it's going to go. I don't think so much it's a parallel as it is the continuation of the same story. It's a continuous continuation and intensification. And let me just give you one footnote, because I know that I'm speaking in a place where people usually talk about economics. There was a very curious dynamic in this time. When a young artist asked a high French politician in 1938 who had taken place in part in the Versailles Treaty, what did he think of the treaty in the negotiation? What did he think of the treaty? Paul de Chanel answered, "Nous venons de signer la Deuxième Guerre mondiale. We have just signed the Second World War." And he was not the only one to realize that. John Maynard Keynes was another one to realize that this treaty bought time, but was not a resolution of anything. And indeed, economically speaking, perhaps not morally speaking, but economically speaking, to weaken the central economy in Europe so far that no democratic institutions, no other institutions, no stable economy could take root, was in effect a recipe for disaster, and gives credence to the fact, what some historians say, that in fact we're looking at Europe's second 30 years war, because the peacetime was in no way a peacetime. There were coups d'etat, there were violent revolutions. Only in Germany between 1918 and 1923, 5,000 people were killed through political violence. That's what we would call today a civil war. It led to the Spanish Civil War. There was never peace as such. But what really broke the back of this time, after in the late 20s, hope came up again. Hope began to blossom again. Political unrest began to subside. Economies were stabilizing. Societies were showing signs of optimism again. What really broke the back of this was the Wall Street crash in 1929. After that, there was no longer any hope. It was perfectly clear to most people who were at all far-sighted that the level of destabilization, the level of mitigated functioning statehood that this meant to many countries would mean that the ideological differences in this world would take over, and it was really clear from that point on that the result of this could only be catastrophe. Thank you.
Thank you very much.